Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, and I manage the SAGE Research Methods community. I'm pleased to be joined here today by Julianne Cheek and Elise Obi, who are co-authors of this book on research design that we're going to discuss today. But before we get started, if you are new to our community, this is a site that focuses on all stages of the research process, writing about our results and sharing them in all different kinds of ways, and teaching and learning. Whether you're a beginner or an experienced researcher, we hope you'll find something new to learn. So to get started, why don't you begin by just briefly introducing yourselves, and then we're going to discuss chapter 7 of the book.
Hi, I'm Julianne Cheek. I'm a professor at Østfold University College in Norway and one of the authors of the book Research Design, Why Thinking Matters.
And I'm Elise Obi. I'm the other author of that book, and I work in Kristiania University College in Norway.
So your book covers both qualitative and quantitative approaches, but for chapter 7, we're going to look specifically at qualitative data and the process for analyzing qualitative data you describe as iterative and reflexive and inductive. So what do you mean by this? Maybe start by defining those terms for people who are new.
Yeah, so I'll define them by sort of explaining the process and by the definition by doing almost. So in qualitative research, it's not necessarily usual to collect all of your information before you actually begin analyzing any of it. That's quite different than if you're after a set number of numbers, for example, or people in your sample in a more quantitative approach. You need that sample before you can actually begin some of the procedures. So the iterative process is one where we begin our analysis. We might do an interview and we get some hunches or tips about what's going on, what people have said to us that might be significant, etc., etc. And then we will do another interview and we will compare what people in that interview have said that we think is significant to what people in the first interview have said and we thought was significant. And we go through these cycles of collecting information and comparing, etc., and seeing what's happening. This is the iterative process. So Mike Agar, a very famous ethnographer, anthropologist, gave this example of iterative process. You keep asking yourself lots of questions, both about the data itself, what you're saying about it, and how you're using that data. And in the book, we actually put in a figure which we don't need. You don't really need. I can just give you some of the key points from that figure. You learn something. That is, you collect some qualitative data. You try to make sense of it. You analyze. So that's the first iterative loop. You go back and see if your interpretation makes sense in light of the new experience of more data. You then go through and refine your interpretation in light of that new data. You do your next interview and you go back and you refine in light of that. So you are constantly reflexively thinking, and we've mentioned the word reflexive in our first podcast. Reflexive is when we're folding back on our own thinking. We're thinking about, is what we were suspecting there in fact the case? What does this new information tell us about that? How might we need to change our thinking in some way? And iterative refers to this series of cycles driven by this type of thinking, this type of reflexive thinking. Inductivity and inductive we've talked about before in our third podcast, which was about types of questions and thinking. It's where we don't go in necessarily with preconceived ideas that we are testing or we think that we're going to find or we're looking for. It's more that the ideas arise, like Agar says, you learn something by collecting the data, you try to make sense of it, and then you go back and see if it makes sense in terms of what other people have said and also other studies that have been done. So you are inductively building very rich, thick information as a result of this analysis. This is very important in qualitative research. It is called it is an example of what Norman Denson, one of the key pivots in this field, has called the art of interpretation. It is what makes your analysis interpretation rather than just describing, well, in interview 1, X did this, in interview 2, Y did this. That's where you'll end up, and you'll just have a story basically about 10 separate interviews. The art of interpretation is about, I found this, how does it apply to other things? And then how does that apply to what we already know? It's lifting it above the level of description to be an interpretation. So qualitative analysis needs to raise the level of analysis to the art of interpretation. A lot of qualitative analysis slips into just description or storytelling, and that is not fully interpreted qualitative information.
I can't help but think what we discussed in a previous chapter about structure and qualitative data collection, particularly the type that includes participants, but would apply to other types as well. Because if we have a semi-structured or an unstructured type of interview or focus group or observations, then being able to kind of pull what we're learning into the next interaction. It's one approach depending on your methodology, but you might say, well, this is a question I want to ask the subsequent participants because it's it seems like a new theme perhaps that you hadn't thought about before.
Yeah, and the tragedy would be if you'd done all your interviews and you hadn't done any analysis of any of them, and then you find out something like that, you miss that opportunity to do that art of interpretation. You miss that opportunity to get that rich, thick description. These words, rich, in-depth, thick, right, interpretation, analysis, and description, these are words that are associated with qualitative analysis for that reason. We are building this rich picture. We are working inductively. Sure, we might switch a bit deductively later on when we're getting more sure of some of the themes or codes, but it is predominantly an inductively driven process, at least initially.
Right. So I think you've answered some of the reasons why you might emphasize that data collection and analysis occur simultaneously, and certainly different methodologies call for different kinds of approaches, but I think you've described some reasons why beginning the analysis process to at least at the top level is valuable.
Yeah, I think it also points out that whether or not you realize it, when you're interviewing someone and you ask them, oh, that was interesting, tell me more about that. That's like using probes like we discussed in the podcast 6, okay, is actually beginning your analysis because you've got a hunch. Something is interesting here. Something is going on. I need to know more about that. I need to get more information to get a fuller description from which I can make this art of interpretation about this information. So that's just a simple example of why analysis and data collection happen simultaneously. That's within an interview or within an observation, for example. You might observe something that's a bit, well, I better go and observe a bit more of that. I wasn't actually thinking about that when I started, but I need to know more about that, etc., etc. And, as you say, you mentioned themes, we'll talk about codes later on, where, we're developing these ideas or areas that seem to be part of the answer or part of the information that we need in order to be able to address our research problem.
So when you say that analyzing and interpreting qualitative data are strategies, not procedures, what do you mean by that?
Well, it sort of ties up with what we've been talking about before. I mean, standardized procedural rules, right, are where we have the same steps that we proceed through, and proceeding through those steps in certain ways at certain times is part of the validity and reliability of the research. But in qualitative research, the trustworthiness, the credibility, the authenticity of the research, which are the hallmark quality markers of qualitative analysis and research are as a result of being able to work in that iterative, reflexive way. So it's not a standardized way, it's not a procedural way. There are principles that underpin it. It's not an anything goes. And it's very easy to mess up. It's quite easy to do very badly if we don't follow the principles that are outlined. But there are no hard and fast rules how to do it. Having said that, though, all qualitative research requires you to do certain things. One is, the first thing you will need to do is organize your data in some way, that it is able to be read and you're able to go through and analyze it. In the case of an interview, this would be usually turning the spoken words into some form of written transcript that you can work on, and you can go through and highlight key parts of that transcript. Another way is deciding, once you've marked up those interview transcripts of key parts, what parts really are important, what parts go together. So there's this process of getting the information in a form that is able to be analysed, and then it's about working through that information and looking for segments or parts of that information. You call them themes, other people call them codes, okay? These are units of text or units of description of observation or parts of text, okay, or whatever, that in some way are able to produce something that relates to the question that I'm trying to answer and helps me lift my interpretation. The other thing that also contributes to the strategy idea is that on the way through, you often see qualitative analysis referred to as using memos or memoing. And memoing is a very important thing to use. It's very useful. And what memoing is it's nothing mysterious or whatever. It's simply keeping an account and a systematic account of your hunches, your thoughts on the way through. So if I were interviewing you, Janet, and you said something really interesting to me that I think everything you said would be interesting, but if you said something that was particularly pertinent to the research question, I might write a memo. That was interesting that Janet said that at that point. Why at that point and why not earlier? That's an example of a memo, and that's something that I might need to reflect about. And I might even follow up with a question to you either during the interview or later, come back and sort of ask questions about that. So these are all the sorts of things that people do. So there are principles that we need to understand. And Yin, we actually give some of these principles in page 171 of our book. Again, we don't need to have the book, but to see this. But what we talk about is Robert Yin talks about that one way to achieve a credible interpretation is to strive for as many of these things as possible. One, completeness. All right. Have you analyzed your data completely? Have you gone through all of it? Or, do you just skip one, or you stop at 3 and think that's enough, etc. Fairness. If someone else using the same type of qualitative approach and thinking as you came to this information, would they recognize what you've done and do something similar? It may not be exactly the same in terms of memos, etc. But at the end, would it look fairly similar in terms of the interpretation that's given? Empirical accuracy. Can we see where your thinking has come from out of the information that you're given? So it's not just my idea, but it's come out of the information that I was given. Value added, and this is a really important one in terms of the art of interpretation. Does your analysis go beyond what people have said or what you've written down about what you've observed or what a text actually says? Because a lot of people just regurgitate in their analysis section what people said. Participants said this, and we have these huge quotes, but we don't have them interpreted, because interpretation means that what we need is what is it about that quote that adds to what we're trying to find out about the research problem, and how does what we're finding during this iterative process and inductive process relate to what's already known out there, both in substantive, theoretical and methodological literature, and what does my study add? Value adding. What does my study add to this? This is really important, because otherwise we end up with these thin, descriptive, almost storytelling And storytelling is a qualitative approach that is done well, when done well, has all of these hallmarks. But I mean, just like a story, you know,
Right, more
she said, he
right,
said,
more of a
they said.
superficial.
Yeah, and so the last thing that Yin talks about is credibility. Okay, and credibility and other words that you'll see associated with qualitative analysis, trustworthiness, etc., are a result of those sorts of things. So that's why we emphasize that it's not about following set steps. It's not about procedural stuff. It's about knowing the principles and really understanding this idea of the art of interpretation, enacting it in a way that stands up, and being able to tell about that enactment of the art of interpretation in a way that others can follow and others can make decisions about why should I trust that particular analysis. And Yin gives us some ideas there: completeness, fairness, empirical accuracy, value addedness, and credibility.
Right, right. So do you want to give an example of how that might play out, or?
Yeah, well, we've sort of done it. I've sort of done it a bit, but what I'll do is pull it all together. So strategies that can help us achieve this. I've talked about this before. Organize your information, right? When you do your first interview or your first set of observations, immediately get it into a form that you're able to read that interview. I mean, listen to it, but get your transcription done. Get your field notes of your observation written up, etc. And as you are doing that, even at that stage, begin memoing and collect your memos, like write your memos out and collect those memos together, because later on you will analyze those memos, and those memos are what should be beginning to lift the description from what's in the interview to the hunches about what's going on. And ultimately, when you compare the interviews and the memos across, you will start to find themes or ideas that seem to be emerging across. Might be different aspects of the theme or idea, but themes or ideas that can help address your issue. That's called data condensation in some form. Okay, various people talk about that, various qualitative researchers. Data condensation, making a 40-page interview into units of text that highlight key hunches and memos that have come out of reading that whole interview. So the units of text only make sense in the context of the interview, but you can't work with 40 pages from 10 interviews. You have 400 pages you're trying to work with. So you've got to condense in some way, but you've got to condense in some way that retains the integrity of what was said. And memoing can help, and putting light codes together. So the other strategy that you use is constantly comparing. You'll see that talked about, constantly comparing that code with that code. So in that interview, someone might have said, oh, I felt very sad because when I moved from home to nursing home, I lost all my friends. And this person might say, I felt very sad because when I moved from home to nursing home, I couldn't take all my furniture with me. We might start to say, are those two examples of something like a deep sense of loss? I'm just giving a very quick example there, and you would need to work a lot more on that. But you can see what I'm looking for is not necessarily the same words and the same examples, but similar examples of something. And the analysis, the art of interpretation, is getting at what is the something that sits behind what these are examples of. What are they examples of? And quite often people stop right at describing the examples, and that's not the analysis. That's the step forward, because the other strategy is, of course, you have to interpret what all these collected codes or themes mean. Sometimes they're called categories, sometimes not. Okay, but what do all of these things together, that what are they examples of? And how do they relate to previous work? Like if I said that they were examples of loss, who else has written about loss? And what have they said in these sorts of situations? And how does my study relate to them? So immediately I'm countering one of the critiques that's leveled at qualitative inquiry, and that is that, well, you've only got 10 interviews. No, I haven't. I've got 10 interviews that I've constantly compared, and I'm comparing it to any number of studies, all right, that have done work in that area if I'm doing it. certainly that criticism is very valid if we are not lifting our analysis into the art of interpretation and merely describing, okay. So it is very important to do that, because what we want to do is we want to give rise to what we call thick description and thick interpretation. And we ask some questions in the book that will give you a clue as to what such thick description and thick interpretation involves, and ask yourself questions like this. Can the findings of my research help understand the problem that triggered the research in the first place? Why or why not? I mean, this is an art of interpretation. Or how can the findings be used in practice? Okay, that's interpreting in another way. Or what theoretical concepts can be used to address and add richness and help explain what I have found? So, you know, a theoretical work is not usually very rich. How does what I have found add or change, support, or otherwise those theories or concepts? So, you know, my study is not standing alone, it's standing in this massive body of work in this area. What is my contribution to it? And what ideas might need to be explored in further research? We actually have a few more questions, which I won't go through. I wanted to give the flavour of the question, that you need to be reflexively and iteratively asking yourself all the way through the analysis in order to lift your research to the art of interpretation. And finally, in terms of the strategies, it's important to know when you are done, or when you can say that you are done in terms of you have enough. And it doesn't, enough in qualitative data is really a moot point, in that we can't ever give a number, okay? But what we can say is this, that often people talk about this idea of saturation, that saturation is sometimes misused by people as well. But what it means is, when we're reading our interviews, we're getting more and more examples of the same sorts of things, but we're not getting more of these underlying things that seem to come out. It doesn't seem like there's another theme or category sitting in there that some of these codes aren't able to be examples of. So when we have our examples, sort of, they seem to be examples of our broad categories, our higher level thinking, our interpreted data, then we might think that we're done. All right, that we have got enough information to say pretty confidently, these are the major themes and categories that came out, and this is why I think so. So a definition of saturation that's given by John Cresswell is that when the researcher stops collecting data because no new data sparks new insights or reveals new properties. Okay, so that's, you know, but what that requires is that you have done the work all the way through from the start of the first interview and whatever, and that you can decide, because decisions about saturation can only be made after a long period of immersion in the data. You have to fully immerse yourself in there. And the other thing is, it's very useful if you've got the perfect diagram of all what you think the major issues and themes are, and then you do an interview and suddenly new information emerges. It's your 20th interview and you thought you were done. Okay, I'm really sorry, but you might have to go back and undo some of what you think are your themes and other things, or else you've got a new theme. So we never, ever, ever put information to one side because, you know, we're done and it doesn't fit. All right, that makes me, if I found out that someone had done that in their qualitative inquiry, I would call it untrustworthy, unauthentic, and not credible. And, you know, consequently, totally flawed research. So it's extremely important to explain how you knew when you were done. That's how I will put it. You know, so, you know, some people talk about saturation, etc. And how many people or how many interviews is a question we get all the time. Can't answer that. I just answered it in terms of principles of knowing when you're done. When are you very confident of your information and it seems to be clear? The other thing is that it depends how information rich the people you interview or the sites you observe are. If you get very rich information from a number of people, you probably won't have to interview as many people as if you are interviewing people who give you, you know, some interviews are very thin, because some people say, I don't think I've got anything that I can tell you. And then if you're not skilled in interviewing, often you will just stop sort of there. They'll say a few things, but sometimes if you can probe, they actually have a lot to tell you. So it's really important to keep going in those situations. So I think the strategies, you know, how do you put it into action? Remember this, in whatever you do, the goal of analysis in qualitative inquiry is to demonstrate authenticity. This came from the information I got. Other people can see where this came from. Credibility, I have used accepted principles and accepted ways of doing this. And trustworthiness, okay, I've indicated on the way through that I have done this. And those things together are ways that we can determine the quality of both the analysis of the qualitative information, but also of the qualitative study and of qualitative inquiry generally.
Okay, so I hope that for our viewers and listeners here, you've got some questions and thoughts to apply to your own data analysis process, so you can think it through more carefully. So thank you, and we'll go on, and we hope that you'll continue to watch this series and see the next chapter.